start off our discussion, just to give our audience a kind of purview of governance. So as we stand, how would you define good governance today?
When we think about governance, what's most important in terms of its elements is that there is transparency, accountability to the public, that there is space for public participation, resources are equitably used, they're used in the public interest, equitability generally. There is also this importance of the rule of law. So these are certain constituent elements of good governance. So another critical issue we have in terms of governance in Sri Lanka today is the centralization of power in the executive and the executive presidency. We've seen that call out on the streets, among specialists who have talked about it. So good governance is sometimes seen as the antithesis of corruption. So in Sri Lanka right now, we have a huge problem of corruption. We see this through the evidence of the IMF's governance diagnostic. The IMF, when coming into Sri Lanka with the extended fund facility, decided to conduct a governance diagnostic assessment for Sri Lanka, which is the first it has ever conducted in Asia. So that points not to economic factors but to mismanagement, for the betrayal of the public trust, and this is borne out in the judgment of the Supreme Court as well.
Are you a victim of corruption or are you an enabler? Get to know about good governance with Sankhitha Gunaratne today on our show. Stay tuned.
Some bonds give more returns. Get more security and more interest on your fixed deposits from Sri Lanka's largest finance company, LMDtv Finance.
The latest issue of LMD is available at lmdmall.lk as well as selected supermarkets and bookshops. You can also access the digital version on WhatsApp and our social media platforms.
Hello and welcome to LMDtv. The topic of conversation today is good governance, and I'm here with the Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verité Research, Sankhitha Gunaratne. Sankhitha, thank you for being part of our show and accepting our invitation.
Thank you for having me.
To start off our discussion, just to give our audience a kind of purview of governance. This term has been around for a long time, and I believe its meaning and its implications keep changing. So as we stand, how would you define good governance today?
Right, so we can talk about good governance in terms of an entire country or nation, right? Not in a particular sector. When we think about governance, what's most important in terms of its elements is that there is transparency, that there is accountability to the public, that there is space for public participation, that resources are equitably used, they're used in the public interest, that there's equitability generally, and there is also this importance of the rule of law rather than rule by certain groups, sects or persons in power. So these are certain constituent elements of good governance. So when you think about it in Sri Lanka's context, there are certain key issues that we have in terms of governance. One is that we often talk about, in common parlance, we talk about the politicization of the public service, the politicization of almost anything. So that runs counter to what we call good governance, because we need to allow processes to run in a decentralized manner, in a manner that allows for effective monitoring, effective questioning, answerability. So another critical issue we have in terms of governance in Sri Lanka today is the centralization of power in the executive and the executive presidency. We've seen that call out on the streets, among specialists who have talked about it. But also a key part of the problem of governance in Sri Lanka today is that of corruption. And I think we can talk more about it later on.
So if I ask you this bluntly, how bad is the situation in terms of Sri Lanka standing when it comes to governance?
Well, so good governance is sometimes seen as the or the antithesis of corruption. You know, integrity as being the opposite of corruption, good governance as being the opposite of corruption. So in Sri Lanka right now, we have a huge problem of corruption. We see this through the evidence of the IMF's governance diagnostic. The IMF, when coming into Sri Lanka with the extended fund facility, decided to conduct a governance diagnostic assessment for Sri Lanka, which is the first it has ever conducted in Asia. Wow. And the report that came out in September last year actually shows a really stark picture. It was a really good governance diagnostic assessment, but it shows a stark picture of how badly we are doing in terms of corruption. It makes the point that the problem of corruption in Sri Lanka is what it terms macro-critical. So it has macroeconomic consequences. So to your question of how bad it is, on the one hand, we have the IMF itself acknowledging and bearing out the details of and the nuances of how bad corruption is in Sri Lanka. So now we know that we are in the midst of an economic crisis, and everyone understands that it has had impact on our daily lives. The cost of food has tripled, quadrupled, child malnutrition has gone up. But what we don't often realize in Sri Lanka is that the economic crisis is not merely an economic crisis, but one that is born of a governance crisis. So, I mean, we've heard arguments made that this happened or it was exacerbated because of COVID, or, you know, because of a war somewhere, because of exogenous circumstances. But we didn't, I mean, other countries in the world also went through these things, but didn't hit this kind of economic crisis. So it's truly derived from, or the root cause has been a governance crisis in Sri Lanka. Another way to show this problem, or evidence of this problem, almost definitive evidence of this problem, is the Supreme Court determination, decision, the judgment that came out on the economic crisis in November last year. I think on the 14th of November last year, Supreme Court declared that certain individuals, including central bank governors, presidents, past finance ministers, etc., were responsible for the economic crisis that Sri Lanka is going through. So that points not to economic factors, but to mismanagement, for the betrayal of the public trust, and this is borne out in the judgment of the Supreme Court as well.
It's a pretty bad situation.
It's dire indeed.
But I hope there's, you know, hope on the horizon. And talking of hope, any best practices or models that Sri Lanka can take inspiration from to change our journey looking at the region?
Right. In the region and the world over, what we see is not an entire country's success in the fight against corruption. There tends to be ebb and flow, and Sri Lanka has remained the same, but it's come to a particularly critical point right now. So what's important to do is to take it sectorally. Right. So if you think about reform initiatives in the region, we've seen the business sector, the private sector in Thailand actually make great strides on fighting corruption in the that the private sector experiences through collective action. So if you look at the context of Thailand, it's a little similar. They're not going through the kind of crisis we're going through right now, but the type of corruption that is experienced on a day-to-day basis tends to be systemic, tends to be widespread, prevalent. And businesses often encounter extortive corruption when they have to interact with the public sector, and at the same time you will find the kind of collusive corruption where certain businesses work hand in hand with those in power, either in the public sector or the political sector, to gain a competitive advantage, to get ahead of their competition. So in Thailand, and I speak of this because it's a really interesting example for Sri Lanka to be able to follow, given the similarities in the context, because what we often hear is this story of doom and gloom, of, oh, we are the poor subjects of corruption, there's nothing we can do about it, within the private sector as well. But in Thailand, a group of companies, large companies, not necessarily small companies, and not a lot at the start, a group of companies got together across various sectors, got together and created something called the Coalition Against Corruption, which operated by people coming together in the private sector and saying, look, we will not engage in corruption. So when they stood collectively, then those that would extort bribes and that kind of facilitation payments, for example, would lose that power that they wield over the other part of the equation, right, over the business. So even in Sri Lanka, I mean, let's take it down to a small example of trash collection in our neighborhoods, right? When the trash collection truck comes, everyone feels compelled to pay the 100 rupees or 200 rupees as a bribe, and this is by no means okay, because it's a service that the state is paying for and should be given free of charge because we paid for it by way of taxes. But everyone feels like they don't have a choice but to pay that amount, because if not, your trash will just not be collected. But if the entire neighborhood got together and refused to make the payment, would the trash collection truck be able to still go back and report or act as if they've performed their job? So it's just this simple principle that can be carried through to the entire business sector or across to certain specific sectors. So you can take the shipping, things like that. So one really interesting example is a company called Maersk. We all know them. Something that they did was to so with Maersk, well, one problem that they had was that they kept their agents kept encountering corruption. Their captains, ship captains, kept encountering corruption whenever they had a port of call at a customs level. So what they did was, a simple fix that they employed was to get their captains to report to the company whenever they encountered this, and they started publishing the data. The moment they started publishing the data, they found that the corruption levels dropped tremendously. So it's a simple fix, and it doesn't necessarily have to have regulatory intervention or anything like that, but it almost comes down to a decision to do something about it.
Wow, taking that one initiative.
Exactly.
You drew parallels to the corporate sector of Thailand to Sri Lanka. So, I mean, we have a lot to improve in terms of corporate governance as well. When you look at where we are in terms of corporate governance, where our businesses are standing right now, how would you say those initiatives can be encouraged? I mean, how bad is the pitch, and how much of hope do we have that businesses will do what it takes?
I think one of the main challenges businesses are undergoing is that they often tend to feel, or at least propagate a narrative of being stuck in the middle of a really corrupt context, right?
Like the trash collection.
Right, the trash collection equation. But in the same way, they are also stuck in the middle in terms of having to operate in this system, while their principles might be in jurisdictions or countries where there are severe regulatory enforcement risks that they can encounter, that there will be a huge fine slapped on them. So, and that is a very real possibility. So making sure that the activities down the supply chain are conforming with those high regulatory standards is a challenge that the business sector in Sri Lanka would encounter. But this is also not to say that corporates are necessarily innocent victims in this, because as I alluded to before, on the one hand, there's a lot that they can do to resist and be resilient in the face of corruption, but also we often find corporates taking advantage of the situation. So when we look at corruption as I said, the opposite of good governance in this sense, corruption for the private sector can come in three main forms. One is private to public corruption. So when the private sector engages in the government tender process, for example, what happens is that you might choose to pay a bribe, or you might be extorted for a bribe. So there's an element of coercion, right? So where you're choosing to pay the bribe to get ahead of your competition, then you're just as complicit in the problem for the country and for that particular situation. If you're choosing to do that, you're part of the problem. So you're not an innocent victim in that sense. And the other second category is private to private corruption, right? So engaging in insider dealing, paying bribes when you engage with other companies, other private sector companies, that is also another element of corruption. And a third element is that the private sector are the main enablers of corruption. So if you take lawyers, if you take financial advisors, tax advisors, auditors, they all tend to facilitate corruption. Financial institutions, designated non-finance businesses, so betting and gaming industry, the real estate industry, the banking sector, when they accept deposits or facilitate transactions from individuals or organizations that they know are politically exposed persons that run high-risk transactions, you'll find that there is a very specific conflict of interest between business development in that sense and conforming to the need to act against corruption and conforming to regulatory requirements to report corruption when it happens. So in all these three ways, businesses can get involved in corruption and also therefore have a responsibility not merely to be the victim, but also to act as a bulwark against corruption.
It's time to take a short break, but we'll soon be back to talk more about good governance.
What makes a truly awesome insurance company? Is it the skills to manage big numbers and big responsibilities? Well, that's definitely part of it. But there's more. It's the people. They're awesome. Super passionate about looking out for others and putting in their time for people's finances. It's not just the people. It's how we do things that's awesome. From being trendsetters of the industry to being connectors or inventors. It's about well-being and how we achieve it. Our teams hustle non-stop to meet the needs of the people. That's why we're on the rise. But it's not just about how we do things either. It's about how we improve things. Helping our clients thrive in a world that's full of awesome goals to achieve. Making the maximum out of the minimum. But wait, there's more to it. There's one last thing that truly makes an insurance company awesome. It's that we care about our people and our customers. All of this combined, it's been a pretty awesome year. And we're excited for tomorrow.
Display your brand message on digital screens at prime locations. The largest digital advertising network in Sri Lanka. Emerging Media.
Welcome back to the show. We're in conversation with Sankhitha Gunaratne, the head of governance and anti-corruption at Verité Research. You mentioned, I think, all stakeholders who have a part to play here. This might not be a fair question, but if there were a shortcut that we can take to quickly start an anti-corruption initiative, would it be easier for businesses, do you think, or would there be another stakeholder who can take the plunge? Maybe customers, maybe suppliers, maybe banks.
With anti-corruption, I wouldn't want to simplify it in that way because, as you alluded to, all sectors need to pull their weight, including the citizen at home. We need to make sure we're electing the right people. We need to make sure that we are not the givers of bribes. We need to make sure we don't also support businesses that are engaging in unethical practices. We need to, as employees, just from the citizen perspective, as employees of businesses, not be okay with corrupt practices. We should stop perpetuating these things. But as businesses, I think what is important is that you put in place measures that are commensurate to the level of risk that you encounter in terms of corruption. So the world over, if you look at the UK's Bribery Act, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in the US, France's Loi Sapin-II. All of these, what it requires is for businesses to do an assessment of the corruption risks that they encounter. So in Sri Lanka, what is understood, commonly known, is that when you encounter customs, you tend to be exposed to corruption. So if you're shipping in the shipping industry and tend to get exposed to customs often, then what you would need to do is to take specific measures commensurate to that risk. You are not required to have a massive compliance system that if you are not a person encountering that risk. So businesses often tend to say, oh, don't bring us laws on compliance or private sector bribery because we don't have the money. We are small businesses. We don't have the money. Partly because it doesn't concern us, or they tend to think that it's too much of a burden because they have to now hire compliance professionals and file all these reports, do additional audits. So that is a fear that has been generated, but it's not it's an unfounded fear, because what is required is to have, so you wouldn't ask a small business to have a compliance program that would make you resilient to customs corruption, right? Or if you're not politically exposed, then perhaps that's not a problem. Your concern might be that you have to constantly deal with the registrar of companies or with the land registry and are getting asked 100 rupees to, have access to a folio. So that's what businesses can do, is to look at their own processes and think about what corruption risks they encounter, at risk of repeating. But also when designing the counter interventions to that, right? Designing the measures to address that type of corruption, it's really important to remain contextualized to your sector and to your country and culture. So in Sri Lanka, we would find people, talking about Kalaguna Salakima, or, just helping somebody out. Somebody, it's important for us to maintain our networks. And we often don't even have the language to say no. In Sri Lanka, we often don't have the language to say no to somebody coming and asking us for a bribe in some kind of, in some way. It won't be a direct demand, and then you don't have the language to do that. So for a business, it might be that you help your employees reenact a real situation where you might be asked, and give them levels of responses. It could be that you say, let me check with my company and get back, perhaps we can facilitate this. It's just in order to avoid the immediate demand, right? It could be that you say that, oh, my hands are tied because there is a new Anti-Corruption Act in place, so we are really worried. Or you say that we have an internal process and I would unfortunately be compelled to, report this, and it gets difficult. There is language you can build around that resistance. So I think it's important to really sit and think through this problem, because one thing to note is that in September last year, there was an Anti-Corruption Act passed in Sri Lanka that repeals and replaces the former Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption Act, the Bribery Act, and the Asset Declaration Law. So all three of these have been repealed, amalgamated and replaced by this new Anti-Corruption Act, and that has a very key provision about private sector bribery. So that it brings into the purview of the Anti-Corruption Act the private sector as well. So both those elements of private to private corruption, bribery, and private to public bribery both come into play. So at the board level also, to respond to your question, at the board level also, at the governance level, now the problem of corruption needs to be taken a lot more seriously. And this also presents, I think, a really important opportunity, because in Sri Lanka, we have found across the board that we have lots of laws on paper, but implementation and enforcement remains weak. So now that anti-corruption covers the private sector, one thing that the private sector has to do or is compelled to do is to build this compliance network, compliance systems. So in doing so, an interesting thing happens, which is that you marshal the resources of the private sector to preemptively deal with corruption without having to go to law enforcement. Right? So, because now boards of directors will have to have committees looking at this, they'll have to put processes in place to minimize and mitigate the risk of them being complicit in, say, a bribery scandal. So, by doing that, we have now reduced the burden on law enforcement, but of course, we still need law enforcement to act well enough and effectively for there to be an actual threat of law enforcement. If you look at international examples, one thing that also involved Sri Lanka was the Airbus scandal, where the company Airbus later on in a deferred prosecution agreement and a statement of facts that was made public admitted that the CEO and wife of Sri Lankan Airlines at the time had accepted a bribe of 2 billion rupees to actually facilitate a deal with the Airbus company. Now, this is accepted fact. In doing so, we have actually ended up harming the social fabric, losing faith in the system, and also for Airbus itself at the company level, it was a huge fine of 3.6 billion euros. And it also risks the economy that the company actually operates within. Employees risk losing their jobs. They lose, employee satisfaction, job satisfaction. So it has hugely diffuse impact and often generational impact because of this kind of corruption. So it's really, really important that we think those through as we address the problem of corruption locally as well.
Lots of things to do. You spoke of what board level business leaders can do and also employees. When it comes to especially employee level, do you think it should be fear that prevents people, or at least at the beginning, or should it be accountability?
If you think about it, it can be that it's fear driven by accountability, so heightened monitoring, systems in place, digitization, that kind of like rational choice, like principal agent, systemic approaches to anti-corruption. But the counter to that would be about a value-based, ethics-based, behavioral change, leadership-based approach. What is actually ideal is that you create the kind of culture among employees, among the young people joining across different ranks, and at the very top that actually drives the culture of integrity, of being ethical. That would then set a norm that trickles down, because monitoring or oversight driven system can always only be so strong. It can't go all the way. But if you truly believe in what you're doing, the likelihood of success is much greater.
I'd like to, we covered corporate. Before we wind up the interview, I also want to ask you, what are your recommendations that we can actually instill accountability and an anti-corruption kind of values in us, in the society, because that's where all the employees and the customers and the leaders come from. Maybe it's in children. What are your recommendations to this?
I think, yes, with children across society, we need to truly understand corruption from our own contribution to it. Because I think in Sri Lanka specifically, we have a very good idea of corruption and very nuanced understanding of how corruption happens among others and why we are victims of it and we don't have a choice. But if you again think about the business sector itself, it's important to focus on the consequences of it. If we were to really think about it, because there tends to be what we call victim distance in corruption. When a person engages in corruption, you don't see the consequences immediately. It's not like I hit you and you get hit and fall to the ground. It's that I negotiate some backroom deal so that a tender process is fixed, and a woman somewhere who doesn't have street lights in the night as part of the tender process might be sexually harassed on the street at night because of that failing, because of sub-quality, subpar, services and goods being procured. So it's really important to think of the consequences, and very unfortunately, through the economic crisis, we saw how difficult that became for all of us. We were not able to get from point A to point B, and it was very easy to see that corruption was the problem. So we've had a very difficult lesson, so it's really important not to lose sight of it. So for businesses also, it's important to keep track of the consequences. On the one hand, the first point is that corruption is really expensive. It tends to eat into your bottom line. You don't know how much money you will be extorted for next time, which also makes it unpredictable, makes the business conditions extremely unpredictable. You don't know what you will have to deal with, so it makes the regulatory system unpredictable for you. So the more you're complicit in it, the more you perpetuate this problem. And corruption also always tends to happen in the form of a deal, right? There is an offer of a bribe, there is an acceptance of a bribe, if you take the bribery element of corruption. But what happens if the deal goes awry? If the other party does not honor the commitment, honor used very loosely here, but what happens? You have no legal recourse because it was an illegal transaction in any event. So it's really important to think of these things, and also the larger social implications, what kind of breakdown of the rule of law you're contributing to, and the breakdown of the social fabric that you're contributing to. And we find people, migrating out of the country saying we don't have the right conditions for businesses to operate, we don't have the right conditions for our children to grow up in, while continuing to, on a daily basis, contributing to breaking down that very system that you're complaining about. So it's really important for us to be clear about our level of complicity, be it citizens, be it the business sector, be it politicians or the public sector, civil society, of how we contribute negatively to the problem of corruption.
We've been in conversation with the Head of Governance and Anti-Corruption at Verité Research, Sankhitha Gunaratne. Sankhitha, it was lovely listening to you. I wish we had more time. Thank you very much for being part of the show.
Absolutely, it's been a pleasure.
And to all our viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Until next time, take care.
Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.